Psychedelics. Today, we are joined by Jean-Francois Sobiecki. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, very excited. Your work is really fascinating. Can you give us a bit of an intro on who you are and what you do?
Great, thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Um, Hi, audience. My name is Jean-Francois Sobiecki. I'm an ethnobotanist, author, and herbalist from South Africa. I'm here today to share with you on my recently published book on Amazon, African Psychoactive Plants, Journeys in Phytoalchemy, which outlines my 23-year journey exploring and researching Africa's forgotten to the West psychoactive plants and their applications in treating mental illness and in psychedelic therapy.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. It's a big one. Have you been working on it for quite a while?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, since 1999, Joe.
Incredible. Incredible.
Yeah.
All right, so just to let everybody know out there watching, listening, please feel free to ask questions, comments. We'll see if we can't address them at some point. But yeah, excited to dig in. So I'm very curious, like how did this topic become interesting to you? Like, was it an
Yeah.
experience? Was it a story? How'd that go for you?
Yes. Well, Joe, I had an early interest in herbal medicine. Um, Later in my life, when I was researching these plants, I realized that this interest in herbal medicine came from my grandmothers. There were herbalists in my mother's side of the family. But yeah, the first book I ever bought was an encyclopedia of medicinal plants. So it was in my blood, like I was ecstatic to get this book, and I just absorbed knowledge on medicinal plants and herbalism wherever I could. Um, I wanted to become a herbalist after school, but in South Africa at the time, there was no course being offered to study herbal medicine. So I did a BSc in botany and zoology at the University of Witwatersrand. Um, and it was around that time, Joe, that I picked up a book in the local library on the fly agaric mushroom, the Amanita
Hmm.
muscaria. And I became fascinated how this mushroom could transform consciousness and be used in shamanic healing like it is in by the Koryak tribes in Eurasia. And I researched everything there was to know about it. And that led me on to explore ayahuasca, San Pedro, and psilocybin mushrooms, which I explored with and experimented with. But it was around 1999, Joe, that I asked myself the question, are the traditional healers in Southern Africa using plants like ayahuasca, like the Amazonian shamans are doing, to aid their trance induction and spiritual practices? The literature at the time, for example, Plants of the Gods by Schultes and Hoffman, stated that Africa was poor in visionary plants. But this didn't make sense to me because we have such rich traditions, cultural traditions here, and such rich biodiversity that it just didn't make sense to me. The reasons outlined in the Plants of the Gods was supposedly a cultural reason that stated that the hunter societies of the American Indian societies, they revered and appreciated psychoactive plants as part of their vision quests and as medicine, power medicines to access the supernatural. And supposedly the agriculturalist and pastoralist societies of Asia and Africa lost their reverence and their appreciation of these plants. But what I found after 23 years of researching this was that this is definitely not the case, that the Southern Bantu speaking people, for example, the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Venda, the Swazi, they rely very heavily on psychoactive plants to communicate with their ancestors, to have dreams, to have visions, to treat mental disorders, convulsive conditions, which led to an inventory of 306 species of plants being documented in my book for all these purposes. So this question, Joe, of are the traditional healers, and the traditional healers can be classified in Southern Africa as the Sangomas or the diviners, and the Nyangas or the herbalists. And So this question of whether these traditional healers are using the plants led me to do field work where I was just driven by my curiosity, and I went into the black locations, the black neighborhoods in South Africa, and I started asking people questions. Are you using plants for imibono? So imibono means in Zulu visions. And very soon after asking these questions, I was told of a plant that's called Noto, or the sand bushman poison bulb, that people use for the ispili. It's called the ispili, means the mirror, or it's also called the bioscope, the television. So what people would do is the traditional healers would prepare the bulb and boil the bulb as a decoction and administer a small amount of this bulb decoction to the patient, where the patient would look at a white cloth on the wall, or just a wall, and then they would see everything unfold, the story of what's going on. They often use the Noto, the Buffon disticha is the scientific name, sand poison bulb. They often use it in the locations to find stolen property. So they would see visions of where their property is, and they also used it for divination. But this plant has a very old history with the Khoi San people, the San Bushmen, who were very, very, who revered this plant and had a lot of respect for this plant, so much so that they didn't even talk about the plant much. They used this as a hunting poison originally, but they also used it in their spiritual healing practices. So I just started getting more and more reports from people of plants being used for visionary purposes, and miscellaneous psychoactive healing purposes. At the same time, Joe, I started to do a literature review. So I went into old ethnographies from the 1930s, like these dust-covered, it was like out of a Harry Potter movie. It was like these old dust-covered ethnographies that hadn't been opened since 1930s. And I went and I scoured through the research and through the literature, and I found very interesting anecdotes of plants being used. For example, there's one plant, one ritual called the Gobo, G-O-B-O, Gobo ritual, that the initiate would place their face in a calabash of water mixed with plants, and they would open their eyes and they would see black and red dots. Well, it was described as black and red dots, and then they would cross the river of the ocean of consciousness. And when I heard that, I immediately recognized that these are psychoactive drugs that were going through the membranes of the eyes and exerting their effects through the eyes. There was one priest called Father Ladivant who wrote in 1930 a seminal paper on this called "The Sacred Use of Plants in Basotho Land," where he hypothesized that a lot of these plants that were being used to connect with the ancestors were psychoactive and were used in horn medicines worn around the neck. And he was one of the few researchers that actually made a point way back in 1930, in the 1930s, that these plants are likely to be having psychoactive effects. But what I found is that a lot of these reports were very incidental and anecdotal, and there weren't actually researchers that were focusing on the subject. Apart from one person called Watt, in 1967, he wrote a paper focusing on these plants that were useful for mental health issues. But apart from that, there were very, very few people, researchers doing this. And later when I was doing my research, Joe, I discovered that I understood that the gap in Africa and in Southern Africa was partly due to a relic of the apartheid regime, where the white researchers were very focused on food plants, but not on magic and customary ritually used plants. And so that's where all the psychoactive plants were being used, in those rituals. So people were overlooking that whole area. And even in the late 90s, when I started doing my research, there were a few researchers only looking at Scaletium or Canna, but it was still in its infancy at that stage. So yeah, from doing the fieldwork over the years and the literature review, I compiled this inventory of 306 species used for treating insomnia, mental disorders, visionary and psychedelic purposes, convulsive conditions, etc. Yeah, so it was a fascinating journey doing that research.
So you started in like the southern part of the continent, but I assume you looked all over the place in time. And I'm interested in, did you spend some time around Iboga?
I didn't. I mean, I've known
Hmm.
of Iboga for a long time, but there was so much to research in Southern Africa that I actually focused on Southern Africa.
Mm.
You know, I mean, I didn't really have funds. I wasn't funded by university. It was just my pure
Hmm.
curiosity just to
Mm.
get in my Beetle and my VW Beetle and go into these places. And so what I did was I traced a lot of the healers in Johannesburg and found them through their shops, through their muti or medicinal plant shops, and introduced myself. And it was along that path of doing the fieldwork interviews where I met my future teacher, Miss Letty Maponya. Letty was a Northern Sotho diviner, and I got to know Letty from 1999 for about 15 years. She passed in 2013, but she was instrumental in teaching me about African traditional medicine. She taught me about how to use African herbs for healing. I spent thousands of hours with her, and she became a very close companion. And I learned so much about African traditional healing through her. Um, yeah, she introduced me to a very important category of plants that I'd like to
Please.
to you about tonight, called ubulawu. It's Ubulawu, and ubulawu basically refers to the roots of certain plants that are placed in a 5-liter bucket of water, and that infusion is churned with a forked stick and produces foam. So they characteristically produce foam when you churn them, when you churn that infusion. And it's said that the foam is created by saponins, the chemicals in certain plants. What's really interesting is that the African traditional healers and lay people, they use ubulao to drink with it. So they drink the infusion, and then what they do is they manually stimulate vomiting. So they're not emetics. Some of the literature say they're emetics. They're not emetics. You can drink it until you're full, and then you literally stimulate vomiting. But what is really interesting is when I went to India in 2012, I did a process of healing called panchakarma, which also uses vomiting medicine. And what was really interesting is that my teacher said to me one day, she said, if she doesn't do ubulao and vomit with the medicine, her vision becomes clouded. And this is exactly a reference that I found in an Ayurvedic book that describes vamana therapy or vomiting therapy as unclouding the vision. And so I immediately saw that there's this cross-cultural technology of using vomiting medicines that has an effect on consciousness itself. So what it does really is that the vomiting clears what's called kapha or mucus in Ayurveda. They call it kapha. And it clears the mucus from the chest and the stomach. And what this does is it increases your cognitive ability, your intuition and sensitivity becomes enhanced. You have clearer dreams. And the African people love this because the dreams are the domain of the ancestors. So anything that will make you dream more clearly or more lucidly will be revered as an important tool to connect with the ancestors. And that's what a lot of African people use it for. But more than that, it gives you who you are. So my teacher, Joe, described that Upulao gives you who you are. So in a way, it's I see Ubulao as an internal exploratory tool that links you to your dreams and your intuitions. And what happened was eventually Letty took me through a process of a medicine initiation where I took the Ubulao for 2 weeks. And for the first few days, nothing happened. But after a couple of days, my intuition started and sensitivity started to amplify to the point I faced the deepest questions of my life. So I see this medicine as being like, you could describe it as a psychoactive plant-assisted therapy process that is more subtle than psychedelics, but equally profound. And I have this vision of creating centers in South Africa and possibly in Lesotho, where people could use Ubulao traditionally to go inwards, to find answers within themselves and also connect with their dreams, and using it alongside mindfulness. And I think that would be an incredible use of the African medicine in treating people with mental disorders, because the Ubulao also is used to treat hysteria and mental disorders. We need to do more research to understand how they work in that context. But Ubulao can be classified as African plant teacher medicine. The traditional healers, they utilize the psychedelics, but mostly for divination, for the diviners to see future visions and to divination, and with the Khoisan people, they used it for it's been stated that they used it for trance dancing, but Ubulao seems to be more widely used as a psychoactive to access enhanced states of awareness. Yeah, so it's fascinating. It was such a profound experience because it felt like these questions were in my face and I couldn't get away from them, and it actually really started to frighten me because I couldn't run away from these questions that about my life. But what I also learned in that process, Joe, is that I did this initiation with her where I followed like a dieta, like a shamanic dieta. It's the same concept in Africa. You isolate yourself, you don't have sex with people, you don't watch movies or TV, you just focus on the medicines you consume and what effects they bring out in you. And in this process, there were 3 other important categories that I used. The first being cleansing medicines. So my teacher explained it to me that you cleanse your past. To get new, to go into the new self, you need to let go of the past. So I steamed with certain medicines and cleansed with other medicines to wipe the slate clean. And then I used Ubulao to access new information. But very importantly, I learned that you can't only open with medicines, whether they're psychedelics or more subtle acting psychoactives like Ubulao. You have to also relax. You have to also ground and anchor the information that you've learned through the openings to grow and learn. And this was I had an aha moment the one day because I read a paper by Jiraguay et al. That looked at the Amazonian curanderos initiation plant use, and when how they categorized the sequence of medicines used by the curanderos, by the Amazonian shamans, the categories were nearly identical to what I experienced in my initiation: cleansing, intuition and sensitivity opening, strengthening and protection. And the strengthening is the same as it's very similar to relaxing. So when you relax, you start strengthening yourself. And so what I realize is that these 2 different cultures are using the same sequence of medicines to take the initiate through a process of transformation, which is really incredible because it's like another cross-cultural technology of using plants in a very sophisticated way to take people through periods of destabilization or perturbation where they open to new information and then periods of stabilization and anchoring that information and relaxing. And that's exactly what I did. I used red tree medicine, bark medicine from trees that I used for about a week to help me relax after I was using the ubulao, because the ubulao was turning up the heat, so to speak. Internally, the information was being turned up. So there's this very interesting technology of using the plants in this way. And I think we can learn from this traditional use and apply it in psychedelic assisted therapy, that, you can't just, it's not good just to open up all the time with psychedelics. You need techniques to stabilize and ground and relax yourself, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's other medicines like these red tree medicines, red medicines from trees. But there needs to be a balance between opening and stabilizing. So that's a big thing that I learned during doing this process.
What I like is that it feels as though there's yet another set of spiritual religious practices that seem to mimic a normal arc that we see repeated all over the place. And like you're talking about this kind of initiatory process. It seems like it matches up with elsewhere in like a really interesting way from a totally different place than I would have expected it to be.
Yes.
And that's beautiful.
Yes, exactly. Exactly, Joe. And so I went through this process, and I learned that how important it is to be isolated and not to have impressions from media, because your psyche becomes very, very open and very suggestible. So so these plants can be used as African plant teacher medicine. So I think the same concept that Eduardo Luna talks about in the Mestizo traditions, the Amazonian traditions, where the plants teach you, Ubulao does the same thing. It gives you who you are. So some people dream with it, some people don't. Some people, like myself, had a very heightened intuition and sensitivity, but I didn't necessarily dream much. But yeah, these technologies are, it's fascinating how these two different technologies found the same sequence of plants and the same processes to kind of take a person through the process of growth and learning, which I think we can learn from.
Yeah, exactly. I find it fascinating. It's like totally different types of plants too than we're used to seeing from like perhaps Amazonian cultures or even the Bwiti, right? Like perhaps the Bwiti have a lot of plants they use. I just know there's some, at least iboga in the mix. And I like this idea of cleaning the doors of perception. I like what you're doing with Ayurveda analogy too. I find that fascinating. And yeah, becoming more sensitive and also figuring out how to ground so you're not going too crazy with all of the new impressions or coming in, right?
Yes. Because with psychedelics, from my own experiences, I'll never generalize, but I've had breakthrough experiences, samadhi experiences with DMT, incredible experiences with mushrooms, the ones where I saw the essence of things. Nothing was transformed, or there were no hallucinations or visual disturbances. But so you can have these peak experiences, but then sometimes, you can have overwhelming experiences which can lead to fragmentation and to confusion and paranoia, especially if you're predisposed to mental health illnesses. So they're a double-edged sword. And my teacher was more an advocate for using ubulao. I learned from her that by using ubulao every day, you kind of go through a process of letting go of things. When you're vomiting out things, you're purging, also mentally purging. And slowly but surely, you're learning about yourself through Ubulao. So I think it has a lot of potential as a tool to treat to for self exploration, for spiritual evolution and spiritual development. Um, yeah, the African people use it a lot to connect with their ancestors. But it would be very interesting to see. I'd like to do a study someday soon to find out Western psychonauts' experience of Ubulao. But I do feel that, I know that the Ubulao can be sold as tinctures and drops, but I think that using the Ubulao in a traditional manner with the vomiting is is a very important component of the medicine. Taking out this phlegm from the body seems to have a direct influence on the nervous system's receptivity to information. So I would encourage people to try and use the ubulao in the traditional way, as opposed to a pill or or 2 drops of plants, etc.
Mm. And that's interesting. So curious if we can shift a little bit. I'm curious to have
Yeah.
you explain a little bit to this audience. This is a worldwide audience, right? Not everybody knows much about what's happening in Africa generally, if not the southern parts of Africa, but like this very interesting region, country, Lesotho. Can you share a
Yeah.
little bit about Lesotho and some of the traditions that are there and plants that are there?
Um, Well, I haven't journeyed to do field work in Lesotho per se, but I do know traditional healers that recently there were two new psilocybin mushroom species identified in Lesotho. And what's interesting is that there's a report that these psilocybin species are used together with Buffon as a visionary medicine,
Mm.
which is super interesting. And field work. We are starting up a center at the University of Pretoria to research further the indigenous understandings of Southern Bantu speaking peoples' understandings of treating mental illness. Because from the research I did, the biggest categories of the 306 plant species were the categories used to treat mental disorders and convulsive conditions. There are also, of course, the psychedelic plants, but the vast majority, I think it was 106 species and 102 species, are being used to treat mental disorders. So I think the African traditional healers have a very deep knowledge of how to treat conditions like schizophrenia, um, hysteria, psychosis. I mean, I remember so many plants that, some from Lesotho actually, funny enough, that were burnt in the hut of mad people, and then the fumes would sedate them and calm them down. And so there are a lot of plants that are used to stabilize hysterical patients, for example, or schizophrenic patients. And Buffon in small doses is also used as a sedative, so it can have that effect. But the traditional healers' understandings of their methods of treating specifically mental disorders is hardly researched. So we want to, at the center at University of Pretoria, have collaborations with overseas research bodies to do this work and find out what's remaining. While we still have the traditional healers generations left. But Lesotho has incredible plants. There are a couple of special plants that I'd like to research from Lesotho that are used as memory enhancers or empathogenics, similar to MDMA, that can open the heart center and that are actually used in divination.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, Lesotho is definitely a hotspot of biodiversity and these cultural uses. So yeah, Lesotho is definitely on the map, Joe.
Mm. I love that. Um, are there dietary practices like what you were talking about from Ayurveda where, you know, maybe certain kinds of restriction could lead to certain kinds of results in some of these practices with plants. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. I remember from my initiation, I was I was encouraged to eat very bland foods, so the same as dietas in Amazon, bland foods. And I think it was fish. I was supposed to keep away from fish for some reason. But the most important thing was to be very careful of what impressions you allow into your eyeballs. So no movies, no entertainment. And I remember when I finished that initiation period of using the plants, because I moved very close to my teacher and I rented a place in Jeppystown to specially do this training. Right at the end of the initiation, I thought it was a very good idea to watch a movie. I thought my initiation's over. I can watch a movie, and I pulled out this DVD with The Cove, The Cove with the dolphins. And I watched like 5 minutes of it, and I was horrified, and I switched it off. That evening, I woke up in a startle, like in a shock. I actually screamed, and it felt like there was an apparition that jumped at me. And I phoned my teacher at like 12 o'clock in the evening, and in her very wise and astute way, as she always was, she said to me, "Don't worry, John, nothing," because I thought it was a spirit or something. And she said, "No, it's not." I explained to her what happened, and she said, "Don't worry, burn impepo, because impepo is an incense made from flowers that is used to. It's an anxiolytic. It's similar to frankincense, so it calms your system down, and it's a mainstay of traditional healers. When they do divination, they burn impepo, then they inhale the smoke, and it calms them down, but it also opens up the intuitive faculty. So she just said, burn a lot of impepo, you'll sleep, and we'll talk tomorrow. And then I did that, slept fine. And in the morning, I spoke to her, and she explained to me, no, it's because of what you watched. That material went straight into your deep into your psyche. And so that showed me how important impressions are generally, and how much effect they have, on our psyche, which is, we watch TV and movies of people getting shot and killed all the time. And I don't think it's a good thing generally, but especially when you're doing that training, it's as if your mind is wide open to influences. So you need to keep away from sexual relations where you'll form a link, a spirit connection with that other person, and that'll interfere with your training. So these cultures have all realized the same things, hey Joe. They've realized the importance of isolation, restrictions, sensory restrictions, interpersonal restrictions, learning directly from the plants about yourself. So they're tools of self-knowledge, these plants. You've gone muted, Joe. I don't know why. Sorry. Okay.
So I love this because it really broadens the scope of the conversation in a big way. And a lot of people get kind of trapped in this, not trapped, perhaps limited by this kind of, mushroom, ayahuasca, maybe mescaline kind of orientation, when there's so many different avenues that people can explore, and traditional practices that have been around for quite a bit of time.
Yes. I mean, I see the psychedelic medicine as, from my own experiences and speaking to others and reading and researching, that, the strong psychedelics, I believe they definitely can open you up to a spiritual dimension. But the issue I have around that is that you don't know always what you're going to encounter. And that's why they do so much protection, in the Amazon, because you are opening yourself up to the whole spiritual dimension, which can be hairy at times. You don't know what you're experiencing or what you're in contact with. Whereas Ubulal seems to me more of a self-psychoanalysis tool. It does connect you to dreams, but it's not as intense as a psychedelic experience. And from my own experience, sometimes these psychedelic experiences can be very deep and very transcendental. And sometimes I've had experiences where I didn't know what I was seeing, what they were, what the meanings were of these things. Whereas other times I had the ayahuasca once showed me through a whole process that I needed to stand on my own 2 feet. And when I did stand on my own 2 feet and didn't rely on the facilitator, etc., there was an internal alchemy that happened. So, the plant medicines, the psychedelic medicines can teach you indirectly too about yourself, but they definitely can open you up to spirit dimensions, which I don't know, can sometimes be risky, I think.
I was on stage last summer with an elder in the Native American church, and they have a kind of long-standing peyote practice. And
Yes.
he had a lot of concerns about kind of contemporary psychedelic culture, particularly around, opening the door to different spirit things. Is this a conversation that happens in some of the African communities you've been exposed to? Like, we
Mm.
we know the spirit world is vast, but we want to let the right ones in. Is that a concept that is discussed?
Um, I didn't really focus on that, but I remember my teacher was saying that, if I recall correctly, she was saying that the psychedelic plants can lead to false visions,
Mm.
and true visions are seen with ubulao. That was her words. Um, I mean, there were some medicines described that the Shangan used, that where you cut the tongue and you put the medicine on the tongue. And she
Mm.
described that sometimes people don't come back from those trips. They go completely, they just get lost in the trip and they never come out. So maybe that's a bias. I mean, there's the psychedelics have so much potential on so many levels, but I think even Rick Strassman mentioned that a complicating factor in his research in the clinics was this whole spiritual factor, the spiritual entities and factor as a factor in the healing process, which is hard to measure or to make sense of, which complicated the research. So I think there's definitely that. I think they open you so much and so quickly that you can be obviously engaging so many different energies on so many different levels, if not done correctly, or if you don't have a firm intention, or if the space isn't protected properly, things can go obviously pear shaped very quickly. But you know, yeah, I mean,
Mm.
it leads to a whole different conversation of, like, what is spirit and spirituality and how do we engage it, etc. Um, my main thinking is it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. I mean, these are antenna that open you up to information. But if a person is psychologically imbalanced, or suffering from paranoia already, or mental health disorder, it can really tip the scales for people who are already battling to manage their minds. If they then, you know, open up their minds to spirits or to spiritual dimensions, etc., that is a potential issue.
Mm. Now, what other beyond spirituality are there other like really interesting use cases? Like, I imagine there's all sorts of interesting medical treatments that are kind of in the folk tradition that have yet to be really explored, but you've kind of done a lot of that ground research, right?
Yes. In relation to what kind of use, Joe?
Just any kind of medical thing. It could be like an eye salve, it could be like antibiotics, it could be all sorts of
I mean, there's there's everything from, I mean, we have Muti markets, medicinal plant markets in Johannesburg, where it's a pharmacy. So you use certain plants for pain and inflammation, many plants for treating infections, for steaming. So the big methods of using plants in Africa and Southern African traditional medicine is steaming, futa. It's called futa, Futa. And futa is wonderful because you relax very well with it. So it's typically ground up bark, also red medicines, that you then pour boiling water and you cover yourself. And these medicines, they kind of have a very deep relaxing effect on the system. And that's also another method that I foresee in the near future when there are these centers. I see these centers being created in South Africa, in Lesotho, to apply the traditional methods of using these plants for treating people with mental health illnesses. And steaming with medicines is a great way, and as well as bathing with medicines. So you put the decoction of the boiled bark into your bath water and you soak in it. And the medicine relaxes people very, very well. So, but I mean, I found such interesting, like a diversity of plants and animals being used for psychoactive purposes. For example, from psychoactive ubulao seaweed, there is a white seaweed that is actually used as an ubulao. From that to people smoking ants' nests for visions. And I remember seeing an article that in Mexico, there's a tradition of smoking ants' nests for visionary purposes. So it's the African people have found so many forms of medicine. But what I also realize is that a lot of the medicines were derived from the roots of trees and indigenous fruit trees stem. And so the African people were exploring a lot with the active constituents in roots. And I hypothesize that roots are very biochemically rich. I don't know if this is true or not, but there's a lot of decomposition happening underground. So the roots hold a lot of phytochemicals which are used to treat convulsive conditions or mental disorders. So there's so much to be researched, but we're only on starting up the research in Southern Africa really right now, Joe. So my work was, my book's been like the groundwork for all this other research that can happen and that will happen. And the idea is to be socially responsible with doing this research, access benefit sharing with communities that are involved or traditional healers that are involved, and being culturally sensitive, because one thing I was taught is that I don't reveal some of the plants that are initiation secrets. It's you need to go through that process to learn the plants. You can't just divulge it, all the plants to anybody. So there is very sensitive material that needs to be respected by research bodies who want to make novel compound discovery, etc. But yeah, I mean that's part of the process, I suppose. It's just to.
Do you have any thoughts on the Nagoya Protocol or how that would play into this kind of responsible process?
It's been a long time since I did the research on that, Joe. All I know is that in Southern Africa, there's a very solid framework of doing access benefit sharing, where you have to do prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, and it's hurdles that people have to cross if they want to develop products from Southern African plants. So there are strict like legislation now, legislative processes in place in universities to do the research. But that as long as the communities can be involved and benefit from the research, then, and they understand the results of the research, then there shouldn't be a problem with that.
That's great. I love that South Africa has that already baked in, and Nagoya Protocol seems really slow and difficult to adopt, but a national standard seems very logical. Like here's our domestic process for doing this, and there's so much interesting plant life there. That
Yes, no, it's all sorts. I mean, it's fascinating. Just the diversity of methods of administration. Even from nasal drops, eye drops. Elsewhere in Africa, they use visionary eye drops from plants, and but to understand, like I say again, to understand the traditional healers' conceptualization of mental illness, and because, like, for example, ubulao can be used for connecting with your ancestors, but it can be used also for a person who's just going through mental disorder, independently from spiritual uses. So we really need to try and understand how the traditional healers here conceptualize mental illness, and sometimes it's thought that it's a possession, that's causing the problem. But there is also an understanding of pure people who are just mad or hysterical or schizophrenic, and to understand how they use plants for that will be a very, very fruitful endeavor.
Mm. So we talked a little bit earlier before we recorded about this concept where I don't know how to introduce it gently, but the idea is that the most valuable thing on the planet is, in my opinion, is genetic diversity. And like, there's so many plants we don't understand yet. They took a very long time to make it to where they are today, and we're losing a lot of species at an alarming rate. Do you have anything you want to add to that line of thinking?
I do also have a vision of creating conservation gardens and healing gardens that can incorporate conservation of the ubulao species, because we know that certain ubulao species are under threat and are under severe demand. I've heard of there being warehouses filled with Silene undulata or Silene capensis, the dream root, in the Netherlands, and these companies, I don't know if they're investing in conservation methods, but it's definitely unsustainable. And at some point, there needs to be gardens or programs to grow these plants for conservation if the demand increases with with psychonauts around the world. That is a whole area of research that could easily be a doctorate or a couple of master's theses on what impact is this having. There are certain ubulao species that are very heavily utilized. I don't want to really name them so that they're even more utilized, but that are certainly getting around the world and having profound effects on dreaming. But those plants, the roots of the plants are being taken out, and of course the plant is being destroyed in the process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough to see this. We see it with peyote here.
Yes.
We see it with the boga quite a bit.
Yes.
Bufo alvarius toad, which I find like really troubling because a desert animal species. It's a really hard environment for an amphibian to live and do well in. It's alarming, and I try my best to convince people not to use these things because of their threatened status. I don't know if they're all officially threatened or not, but it's a hard process to get something on those lists. So it's worthy that you're doing this conservation initiative, or we're hopeful to do that. So thanks for
it needs to be initiated. It hasn't been initiated yet. I mean, I have a whole vision of the gardens, these healing gardens, and how they would look and how they would function as treatment centers. But definitely the conservation aspect can be included in that. I mean, there's a silene species. There's 3 silene species used in South Africa, all for dreaming, and one of them is called Isiguayana. And what I noticed over the years of 23 years is that over time, Isiguayana became less and less available. So it's the impact of it, people using it and its popularity is causing the plant to be less and less harvested, because there are fewer around. So yeah, we definitely do need those conservation strategies, and it's a beautiful vision to have, like to grow all these plants in a garden, a bit like Botanical Dimensions is, I suppose. An African Botanical Dimensions garden would be amazing, and could spark off, chemical analyses of the plants, cultural analyses, getting traditional healers to come to the gardens to discuss and share knowledge of what they know of the plants and be involved in the conservation of them. Some traditional healers do believe that this plants grown in gardens don't have the same power or potency as the wild harvested plants, but I would say it's better to have some plants than no plants, and have them completely eradicated from the wild and then not having a choice. So we need to protect them. Yeah, I definitely think so.
Yeah, the beautiful vision for me would be a global network of these things, kind of like traditional botanical gardens, and
Yes.
actually, being resilient to all sorts of potential, disasters, right? Like somebody has a summer that's a little too hot, or power goes out for a little too long, and we lose some species. But like the resiliency and the planning, I think could be really lovely. And yeah, I would encourage any conservation effort around locally saving these things as well. Understand.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. So I think there can be a dovetailing of like treatment centers that can use, for example, Ubulau as a means of introspection and an introspective tool, together with mindfulness training. I think it's so important today in our society with overstimulation that we have, the social media, the TikToks, we're just bombarded. And so we really need mindfulness techniques and mindfulness to be taught to people, and how to center themselves in their minds in today's age. And so these centers could provide like a synergy between Buddhist philosophies and Eastern philosophies, and using Ubulau African plant teacher medicine together, which is, I think, a lovely idea. I think it could really work well. It would be really interesting.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah, I love that concept. So what kind of methods did you use when you were digging in to do a lot of this field work? Would you just go and kind of like draw the plants? I assume you're doing interviews with some sort of structure.
Yes.
Or how did that go for you?
Yeah. So I used everything from structured interviewing to semi-structured interviewing. Most of the time it was semi-structured, where I got to, just befriend traditional healers at their shops, learn about their life, learn about their trade, and participant observation. I mean, I knew Letty for, I think it was 14 years, and I spent, like I said, thousands of hours with her. So I learned a lot about, everything from how to prepare medicines, helping her prepare medicines, to mix medicines, and the dynamics of how traditional healers actually heal is such a beautiful way. It's like an extended family type of vibe, where patients wouldn't ever be ruled by their watch, and if they did, they would just leave. But most of the time, it was this kind of holistic approach of the patient sharing about their life and all the influences that are happening with Letty, and she would sometimes take time to go into the kitchen and sort out her lunch and come back and then talk to the patient more. And so, finding out the actual causes, the root causes of the malady, then she would prescribe medicines, herbal medicines for the person, or do a reading for them, bone throwing, divination. But it's a completely different model to the Western biomedicine model of, we've got 15 minutes, here's your script, this is your, whereas my observations with Letty were that it's like the traditional healer serves like an extended family member to the society. You step into that space of her shop, and you sit down and you relax, and you start sharing your life with her, and you develop a relationship with the healer, and you come back another time for collecting your medicines, and slowly, so the actual relationship with the healer is part of the healing. Whereas that doesn't really happen so much with psychiatry, unfortunately, because of just the time constraints that psychiatrists have, which is understandable. But it's a completely different model. They just work so completely differently in terms of time, in terms of understanding all the different components to the person and what influences their health. And often it's interpersonal relationships or social dynamics that need to be addressed. So the traditional healer would often then prescribe a ritual to empower the patient to empower them to not be a victim to these social pressures or these social elements or interpersonal relationships. So rituals can have a positive effect in that way, that they can empower you, but they're also, to be honest, there's also a dark side to traditional medicine in Africa, where there's a lot of magical thinking and a lot of jealousy and hitting each other with medicines, which I learned over the years does exist. And that, unfortunately, is very detrimental because it leads to paranoia. It leads to things like paranoia and mental instability. If you buy into it too much, or if you practice it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's a complex world, but it's got its light and its shadows.
Mm-hmm. It's super interesting to consider this like totally different paradigm of healing that could be possible. And yeah, I wonder about, further developing this kind of alternative healing framework that a lot of people are engaging in these days. And I prefer the term complementary, because I think there's just some contemporary medicines you can't really do without.
Yes, exactly.
But, blending the two would be really, really curious. If we can do it responsibly and inclusively and not be so exploitive. Yeah. So
yes.
Did this book just come out very recently?
No, it came out last year. Yeah, but after 23 years, it's still very recent. It was interesting how it actually unfolded, because I published research papers over the years at a center at UJ. So the book is like a compilation of the research papers, but together with the narrative of the story of how the research went for me and my personal findings. And there's even a chapter on plants that anyone can use to enhance their memory, to clear space, from my own experimentation and my own notes and my own use of the plants. I've shared plants that people can use just to boost their health and their psychological health. There's a whole chapter on the prejudice against traditional medicine as being unscientific, which is often not the case. Like ubulao looks very unscientific initially when you see somebody churning medicine and vomiting with it, and like what's going on here? This looks very hocus pocus or, superstitious. But
Mm-hmm.
in fact, there are mechanisms, physiological mechanisms involved, neurochemical mechanisms involved, which leads to um, improved cognition, improved memory, enhanced intuition and sensitivity. So for a long time, I didn't understand why they were called lucky medicines, the ubulao. But eventually I understood that lucky is a metaphorical description or indicator for the physiological effects you get from using the ubulao. Enhanced energy, it cleans your body out, you feel enhanced energy, clearer thinking, clearer dreams. So, i.e., you're lucky to experience these things. So the terminology might sound magical sometimes, but it's actually sometimes a direct indicator for physiological actions that the plants are having. So it's not all magical thinking. There's often scientific underlying scientific mechanisms of action
Brilliant.
at play.
So where can people find the book, and what is it called?
They can find it on Amazon. It's on Amazon. And it is African Psychoactive Plants, Journeys in Phytoalchemy. So, yeah, and so it's out there, and it's it's an inventory Bible of African plants, and for future research, it's indispensable. I mean, there's so much. Most of the plants in that 306 plant species list haven't been researched culturally and haven't been researched chemically. So it's a gold mine.
That's so wild. So wild. And finally,
Yeah.
it sounded like what was that large project Dennis McKenna was working on with all the plants worldwide? Um,
Uh,
it was like a ESPD 50 or something like
yes,
that.
yeah, ASPD 50. Yes, that's right. I presented actually with Dennis my work back in 2017 at ESPD 50. It was the start of great things.
Outstanding. All right. Well, anything else you want to throw out before we wrap and step backstage for a moment?
Yeah, I just feel that that these plants can be used in a Western context, especially the ubulao can be used as as inward journey tools for self psychoanalysis, and they hold huge promise for that. They just need to be used correctly and in the right context, and there's a lot of research to be still done. So I'm open to collaborations. As I said, there's a center opening up at the University of Pretoria where we want to do a lot more research. And so if there's any research parties out there overseas who want to collaborate on the cultural, scientific intersection of these plants, feel free to contact me. I have I've done online courses. I've developed online courses for an introduction to psychoactive plants and to things like nutrition for a healthy mind, which are on my website. So my website is phytoalchemy.co.za. So it's PHYTO alchemy.co.za. And I do blog posts, etc. So people can contact me through my website or on my email, phytoalchemist@gmail.com. And happy to connect, happy to collaborate.
Amazing. Jean-Francois, thanks so much, and I hope we get to do it again.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great.